is the Capitol was actually used as a church. Not just any church, but it was actually the largest church in the entire region. From 1800 to 1867, the U.S. Capitol was used for weekly Christian worship services. Thomas Jefferson, while serving as president, attended services in the House chamber and even authorized the Marine Band to be the worship band. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the UnderGod Podcast. My name is Stephen, and I am joined by Pastor Nate. Pastor Nate, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. I'm so excited to be here with you today, ready to dive into some cool stuff. This will be good.
Hey, I've noticed you're wearing a hat.
I'm wearing a hat. I mean, we don't wear hats normally, but do you read the hat? Do you like what it says?
I like obey God.
Obey God. What's the rest of it say?
Resist tyrants. Oh, that's even better.
It gets even better. Who does that remind you of? We went to his memorial, his monument in Washington.
Lincoln,
Jefferson.
We went to several.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually what we're going to do in this episode. You know, me and Pastor Nate had the unique experience. Pastor Nate had been to D.C. a lot. I had actually maybe been once in high school for an afternoon, but it happened on our schedule that we ended up in D.C. twice. The very first was by invitations of an organization called Wallbuilders with Tim and David Barton.
And that's the hat I'm wearing.
That's the hat.
Wallbuilders hat.
That's the hat. And that was really all about reframing faith, really going back to the Christian faith and how it was really embedded in each of the founders. And it was an incredible trip. We got all kinds of behind the scenes, after hours tours of the House of Representatives and all kinds of really, really cool stuff. Some great information that even me as a history major and a Christian didn't actually quite realize. And then several weeks later, we end up back in D.C. on essentially an Israel advocacy trip with Eagle's Wings, an incredible organization, by the way, eagleswings.org. Great organization ran by a good friend of mine, Bishop Robert Stearns. And that was really all about advocating for the people of Israel on the Hill. And that was a very eventful trip as well.
It was super cool.
It was very cool. And so what we want to do in this episode is we want to just share some experience that we had on that trip, hopefully to just give some insight to our listeners about what's happening in D.C., what's really transpiring, but also some of the things that we learned. So let's jump in.
Man, it was a great trip. This was actually my second time going with Wallbuilders on a similar trip. And
you went first, and then we're like, man, I wish Pastor was here.
I'm texting you the whole time.
And
I'm like,
you put it on my schedule a year in advance, just so that I couldn't say no when it came close.
I did. I talked to your wife. I talked to your assistant. And you're coming.
And then I knew I was going back with Eagle's Wings, and I thought, well, I don't want to go by myself. So while we were on that trip, I'm like, Nate, you're coming with me on this one too. And so it was actually a whole lot of fun. The very first one we did the trip with our wives, which was just a blast.
Yeah, they got to learn some stuff too.
But they wouldn't get on the scooters. And so the second trip was incredible because we got on these scooters all around D.C. You can just hop on a scooter and then drop it off and hop on and drop it off.
Going everywhere.
It was actually a whole lot of fun. And so, but anyways, let's jump into each of those trips individually and kind of what God spoke to us and what we learned.
Yeah, so the Wallbuilders trip, just for background, is super cool. So they call it it's kind of a two-part thing. It's a spiritual heritage tour of Washington, D.C. And so they're teaching you a lot of the Christian heritage, spiritual heritage about the founding of our country and even how those things show up in places and spaces around D.C. As you mentioned, an after-hours tour of the Capitol, which is great. We'll talk about some of that. But then there's also a congressional briefing that we did the next day. We're just hearing from a lot of congressmen and even a few senators about what's going on, current events. But the night that we got there, I brought this book because I wanted to show it to everybody. We heard from Congressman Marlin Stutzman. He's a Republican from Indiana's 3rd Congressional District, and he talked with us just about his own story and his faith. But his wife wrote this book, which was just a phenomenal book.
She also spoke, and she was incredible.
She spoke,
absolutely
incredible. And I was, as we were sitting there talking about that, we're like, we got to do a podcast on women in ministry because she's just such a great woman.
Which that's coming next.
That is coming.
I'm very excited
about.
Get
to that soon. But we heard from Christy Stutzman talking about what really got my attention was she was talking about how she went with a congressional delegation with her husband to another country over in Africa. I believe it was Ghana. Please forgive me, Christy, if I'm misquoting which country that was. I believe it was Ghana. And she was talking about meeting with some of their leaders, and they were receiving U.S. aid, not the U.S. aid necessarily, the organization been shut down, but aid from the United States on
not the CIA front.
Not the CIA front.
But actually aid to
They were actually taking and doing some things with this congressional delegation. And one of the leaders of that country said, we appreciate the United States of America for helping us with some of our kind of felt needs. What we don't appreciate is you forcing your immoral agenda on us in order to receive the aid. And he began to complain about how he was being forced by, at that time, that was the Obama administration at that time, to fly like LGBTQ flags and all this stuff, and to force teach, about all the sexual perversion and
To receive the aid.
yeah, in order to receive the aid.
Crazy.
And so, that really set her off. And so she was talking to us about there's actually a spiritual price that gets paid when people are politically silent, the people of God, because stuff like that starts to happen.
Not just in the United States, but everywhere that
Around
we
the
influence.
world. We think
Wow.
of ourselves as like missionaries and a shining light on the hill,
By the way, we were founded by missionaries
We were.
in a way.
Yeah, we were. So anyway, but get this book. First of all, just get this book and read it. It'll really help shape your mind. If you attend our Christian Leadership College later on, Church Leadership College, you're going to have to read this in one of our classes, but it's a great book. So we got to hear from her, and then we did a tour. And one of the things I thought was really cool about the tour is they took us down into the crypt, and they're showing us the statues of some of the founding fathers. And I just took some notes on some of those so we can talk about them.
Yeah, and, some of these I was actually blown away. It's unbelievable how even in K through 12 education, I have a humanities degree that emphasized U.S. history. I would say I was a little embarrassed. There were several of these founding fathers that were incredibly influential in the founding of our nation that I had really never heard of. One of them was Roger Sherman. He was the only founding father to sign all 4 foundational documents: the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. He helped draft the Declaration of Independence. He advocated that civil government, listen to this, must be grounded in biblical morality. He wrote things like God commands all men everywhere to repent, and that the gospel is the only way to salvation. He also practiced daily Bible study and family prayer. His faith literally shaped his entire understanding and legal and political framework. Sherman also promoted a firm connection between Christianity and civic responsibility in the early American governance.
Yeah,
Powerful.
It's so powerful. And David Barton was telling us, if you go read the last will and testament of Roger Sherman. I have a pastor friend named Robert Sherman. Always gets confused in my mind.
I'm sure he's great too.
He's pretty great. Yeah. But Roger Sherman, in his last will and testament, which he wrote to his kids, he gives one of the greatest gospel presentations that you'll ever read. And so it's pretty fantastic.
Well, it's one of those things we always talk about. Do you care if your kids go to Harvard or if they go to heaven? And it's very clear as we began to learn about all of these founders, some well-known, some like Roger Sherman that I'd never heard of, how they were maniacally focused on the most important thing, which was the moral development of their children and their families. That's actually what drove them into the public square wherever they found themselves. And so I think that's really, really important as we talk about how important it is as Christians that we understand our heritage and our past, but also that those stories, they've lived their story, Now it's our time to go, hey, what do we want for our families? Do we want to leave a better republic than we found it? That's going to take intentionality, and it's going to take us also, like these men, engaging in the public square.
Yeah, as you're just talking about that, we'll get off our notes for a second, because you're just sort of striking something in my heart as I hear you talk, is that right now, one of the dangers that we have in our country today is that we're all living in the benefit and blessing of someone else's sacrifice, but so many people aren't sacrificing to keep it going. And I'm not just talking about military. I mean, there's a lot of people that do that, but even in the church, when I just think about, man, there's so many people that would prioritize sporting events over having their kids in church, for example. And again, this, I have a
You love sports.
I love sports. I have kids that play sports. I'm not an anti-sports guy at all. But I do think that keeping your kids in the house of God and training them, and to think biblically about the things that are happening in the world, and then empowering them, not just to think stuff, but to speak stuff and to be leaders as well in culture. If we don't do that, if all we do is live in the shade of the blessing and prosperity that other people's sacrifices gave us, it's going to come to an end. And it already is. It's rapidly happening,
Yeah.
So that's
it's interesting. I had for whatever reason, the last few weeks, every week at our church, we have, as a part of worship, we have a time where people come down to the altar. I don't know what it has been, but the last several weeks, I've been inundated with young people, teenagers. I mean, anywhere from 13 to 22. And, one of the things I always do when I pray for them is one of the things that I make sure that I impress upon them is that you're not just leaders tomorrow. you're not just a ball of potential. You're leaders today.
Yeah.
And I remind them what Paul told a young Timothy who was constantly being bombarded with, "Hey, what do you know? You're young."
Right.
He said, "Don't let them despise you because of your youth, but be an example to them in every way." And so, I think that again goes into this message of these founders. One of the really the connecting tissues is everything in their public life came from their private life.
Yeah.
They really, really cared about following God, and they honestly didn't have a lot of the reservations that Christians have today about sharing their faith in public, about being bold about where they stood. These were all imperfect men.
Right.
I mean, just like somebody someday is going to write a history about all of our imperfections. I like to tell parents, it doesn't matter how well you parent a kid. Okay, they're definitely going to need Jesus, and they're going to need some counseling. And so it's not about perfection, but it is about making sure that we're orienting our families, because so goes the family, so goes the nation. I can't help but be struck as we go through people like Roger Sherman. In a minute, you're going to talk about Benjamin Rush and several others. That really was their focus. They were pointed towards God. They weren't perfect. They fell on their faces at times. They didn't always say things in the right way at the right time. However, God used them to really establish the greatest country that's ever been on planet Earth. And if you're listening to this and that sounds arrogant, that's actually historical. When you take a look at the nation that has actually sent the most missionaries, that has supported the most freedom throughout the world, we've actually done the most good. Several weeks later, we would go and we would be with our Jewish brothers and sisters and 300 rabbis and pastors. I mean, it was a great group. And even the rabbis would be like, they were incredibly thankful. Like, they love the United States. They love even Christians. I mean, one of the rabbis, said something to me. Listen, America's better when more people are Christian.
Yeah.
And when America's better, we're able to exercise our faith in an even greater way. And so, anyways, I just thought that
was really good. I didn't even write all this down. Of course, we got some notes in front of us to jog our memory, but I was thinking about also while we were in the crypt, two other guys that we learned about. One was Peter Muhlenberg. And Peter Muhlenberg is worth mentioning because if you've heard of the Black Robe Regiment of the American Revolution, this guy was a pastor who got up in his pulpit. He was both a Lutheran and an Episcopal pastor. Sometimes this was weird. This would happen back in those days. You'd have one pastor.
They'd put on a hat and then they put on another hat. Yeah, that's funny.
So he got up and he did a sermon out of Ecclesiastes, and he talked about a time for everything. There's a time for love, a time for hate, a time for peace, a time for war. And he said, and this right now is a time for war. And so he took off his priestly robe, and underneath it, he was wearing a United States, what would become the United States, but at that point in time, it was the colonies. Their army outfit, their uniform, he had on, and he's like, "Hey, I'm dressed and ready." And he called all the men in his church. This wasn't a small church. He got 300 men to stand up and say, "We'll go fight today." Now, the interesting thing about him is he had a brother named Frederick who was a pastor in New York, and Frederick was like a pacifist, Frederick Muhlenberg. And so you can read letters where they're writing between each other, and Peter's like telling him, "You got to get in the fight," and he's like, "No way, dude, I'm not getting in the fight. We're supposed to be pacifists." Well, then Frederick's church gets burned to the ground.
That'll do it.
That'll change your tune pretty fast. And so then Frederick Muhlenberg, another pastor, gets involved in the Revolutionary War, becomes a Revolutionary War hero, and he actually became the first Speaker of the House of Representatives. So there's two more pastors that we learned about when we saw their statues.
There were a lot more pastors in Washington then than there are now. Well, I guess Washington hadn't been established, but I think we kind of know what we're saying. I think that ultimately putting our faith forward is huge. Another one of the founders, I have heard of Benjamin Rush, but learned some extra things about him.
Yeah.
He's called the father of American medicine. He's a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He advocated for the use of the Bible in public education, writing this. This is incredible. The Bible contains more knowledge necessary to man in his present state than any other book in the world. One of the things I love to remind our church is the Bible is not just a book about what happened. It's a book about what always happens. It's literally the cycle of history. And if you can find yourself in that cycle, right, you can step into all that God wants you to do and be. He also worked to abolish slavery and reform mental health care as a Christian humanitarian. He publicly affirmed his belief in Jesus Christ as Savior and the necessity of national repentance. He believed moral regeneration through Christ was the key to sustaining a free republic.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's just another great founding father. I mean, and by the way, we're not cherry picking. Like we could do multiple episodes on all of these people. Like they were almost entirely. There's a few people that weren't, but almost
The few people that
entirely.
weren't, though, and this is important, the few people that weren't are oftentimes those people that the media and these revisionist historians love to put as like the majority. But
Yeah.
they weren't. They were actually a very small minority. And even many of them, I'm thinking in the case of Thomas Jefferson, he was a young man.
Yeah.
And a lot of people be like, well, he was a deist. He didn't really affirm Jesus and all of this. And he has this Bible where he takes out all the miracles and all of this stuff. But when you actually walk Jefferson all the way through his presidency, and he got to see what happens when a nation or a revolution happens with God and without God. I mean, he's looking, and at the beginning, he's saying, man, the French Revolution, this is incredible. We're going to help these guys. But then he sees it devolve into complete hedonism, and he sees the reign of terror and all the wickedness and the murder that's happening there. It actually pushes him closer to God and to Jesus and to his faith. And so he ended his life way closer to God. By the way, this is usually what happens. I mean, when you're younger, you're more idealistic. You literally think you can just take yourself out of history, and you're inside a really good person. You're not really real with yourself. But then life happens, and you begin to look around. You begin to see how God works in nations and in events, and it actually humbles you, and it brings you back to your faith. I think about our church today. We just moved into a building in November. And we just needed more space. We were already packed out, but we've added 600-700 adults since November. That's been less than 6 months. And the majority of the people, and this is so interesting, these are the majority of the people are, they started off as these young ideologues. They had some kind of faith background in their family, but they said, I know better. They went off and then life hit them, and they began to look at how it works. And, there's something about idealism that's good when things need to change, but also can hold you back. It's like reality tends to punch you in the face.
Yeah.
I don't know about that, but the reality of like, wow, people are sinful, and wow, we really do need a savior. And wow, they're looking at the world around them, and many of them are coming back to faith. They're coming back to faith, or even faith for the first time. They were kind of some of those young people who are like, man, I don't believe in God. And I don't, here's the thing. I love saying this to people. Your belief doesn't actually make God exist.
Right.
Like he exists whether you believe him to exist. We're going through a series where we just finished up the 10 Commandments. It's like those are actually 10 statements or axioms, as the Hebrew brothers would have said. They would have been like, these are just self-evident truths. Like, you run into one of these, like you break one of these, they break you. It's just how it is. And it's in that brokenness that we find Christ. And we see a lot of that as you walk through many of the founders from the revolutionary generation all the way through to even the first, the first president with George Washington, the first Congress, and all of that stuff being worked out. You see this kind of evolution, for lack of a better word, of these people who they understood the Bible, they were passionate about the Bible, but they really grew into their faith as they entered the public square.
Their circumstances pushed them. So there were people who were under a lot of pressure, an enormous amount of pressure, and they're trying to build something great. So, I mean, let that be a key to you, first of all. Like, pressure's not a bad thing.
No.
Pressure will push you towards God and towards your potential all at the same time. And then if you're trying to actually build something that will last, then you'll do it with focus and you'll want divine inspiration. I spoke at a Memorial Day event recently, and I was talking to them. I'm like, I'm sitting here in a room full of veterans, and we're honoring those who've died. And it's like, the ones who've been in the foxholes usually come back with some kind of faith. There's not a lot of atheists in a foxhole.
No.
We're talking about that. But yeah, getting back to some of the...
Can I do the next two? Because these are some of my favorites. And so I want
on the next guy, I want you to talk about his son too.
Oh, I know.
When you were standing in the rotunda.
I know a lot about his son. It was powerful. So the next one is John Adams. He was the second U.S. president and the signer of the Declaration of Independence. He declared this reality: our Constitution was made only for moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. He advocated for public religion as essential to liberty and virtue in government. He corresponded frequently with his wife Abigail, another strong, godly woman, about scripture and divine providence. He believed that Christianity was the source of American freedom and justice. I actually, I've read a lot about John Adams. By the way, there's lots of great books on John Adams. I believe there's one called John Adams. There's even a mini series that's called John Adams. I want to encourage you. I think it might be on the History Channel. You want to definitely watch it. It was really, really good. It's based on the book. But I've studied a lot of his son, John Quincy Adams. And it's interesting, as we were starting the school, I was actually reading a biography of John Quincy Adams, and we were trying to decide what type of education we wanted to do. You have the Prussian model, which kind of came at the turn of the 19th century, which has been kind of a disaster. People are just widgets. You train them to do a job, and that's it.
Yeah.
Kind of took out the emphasis on moral education. But then you have classical education, and it's really reviving in our culture today, in our country today. We have a Christian classical school. We actually picked that. As I'm reading the biography of John Quincy, his parents literally educated him right in. He would go on to be an ambassador. He would go on to be a president, an incredible figure in the government. But they actually educated him in a classically Christian way. And when we were it was called Statuary Hall, I believe. You keep calling it the crypt. I don't know what that means.
Well, the crypt was the one below.
Okay, I'm getting confused. It's huge.
And then Statuary.
Well, we were in Statuary Hall where states can put their statues, and it's where the original House of Representatives used to be. And John Quincy has an interesting story. He would actually be beat for the presidency by Andrew Jackson. And usually when somebody loses the presidency, it's like they just kind of go away. Like John Kerry, he started worshiping the religion of climate and just kind of went off. And you have all these different people. Usually, they'll pop up here and there. They'll do speeches here and there, but they're kind of gone. But not John Quincy. But not John Quincy. John Quincy would come back and serve, I think it was 17 years. I think that's right. I know I'm within a year or two. Historians always joke, what's a few hundred years between friends? Because it's like history's longer than just our moment. But he would go back and serve 17 sessions in the House. And we were sitting in Statuary Hall, and I believe it was David Barton. David Barton was talking about the time when John Quincy was in. He was in his very last year. He would actually die in Congress in that area. They actually had the room that he died with the exact same sofa. I think people today go in there and like sip coffee or have meetings. It's pretty funny. I'm like, I don't think they realize that somebody died here. But he would actually die there. And in his last session, there would be a young congressman that would essentially be incredibly inspired by John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was he was an abolitionist. He hated slavery. Matter of fact, his entire tenure, he would stand up against slavery, and he would always have this message. And he had all of these convictions, and they were constantly going forth. And there was a young man that was
stop him.
They tried. Oh man, they tried to. All the rules, everything we see today, it's happened before, and it's just televised today. And it was a real nasty environment. But everyone respected John Quincy Adams, and there was a young congressman from Illinois, and this congressman would go on to run again and lose, then run for the Senate and lose. He would have several losses, but then he would become Abraham Lincoln, the president that would literally abolish slavery. And one of the most impactful moments when I'm hearing David Barton, I get teared up thinking about it, is he looked at this group of pastors, and some of us were younger, some of us were older, and he said, some of you're John Quincy Adamses. Like, you'll never see the investment you make. Some of you are Abraham Lincolns, and you're going to take the message and you're going to actually see the fulfillment of the promise. And I think about the Bible. You think about the fulfillment in the generations. They thought generationally. And what was so incredible is I'm sitting there with my wife and we're listening, and I'm just like, kind of wiping off tears. Like, I think I'm an Abraham Lincoln. It was really good. And I remember, and I look down at my feet, and there are these plaques where all of their desk were, and I'm literally standing on the exact spot where Abraham Lincoln's desk was. And what a great picture. I think sometimes we look at our history and we look at how far we've drifted and we think that there's no hope. But what does the Bible tell us? There were many times the children of Israel drifted. That's like the path, It's like you follow God, and then you know about God, and then you know not God, and then trouble comes, and you always have something to return to. And I couldn't help but be filled with hope in that moment, even for our current situation. It's like, it doesn't matter how far you've drifted. God can do something incredible with the remnant. And if you just turn back to him and just do the next thing he tells you to do and obey him, it's unbelievable what you could do and what you could accomplish.
Of course, he would say, like, our duty is obedience and God's responsibility is results, I mean, that's just, it's so great.
So George Washington,
Washington, of course, I mean, the whole city's named after him. He took it.
Our first president, for those of you who went to public school, he's our first president. That very important figure, not a racist like everyone says. He was actually an incredible president.
Tell you what you should already know. I guarantee you somebody out there does not know.
Well, I just want to let you know.
He took his oath of office on a Bible, which is why we still do it, because he insisted on doing it. When he was done, he actually kissed it. He regularly attended church and emphasized divine providence in many of his speeches and letters. Of course, his farewell address, he's famous for saying that religion and morality are indispensable supports for political prosperity. He supported public days of prayer and fasting and thanksgiving. I mean, we had multiple days of public humiliation. And of course, that's not to make you look bad. That's to humble yourself. That's what that is, where we decide we're going to humble ourselves before God in thanksgiving. And he's referred to as the father of this country, not only politically, but morally and spiritually. The whole place is named after him. And you see stuff about him all the time. I'll skip down actually just for a second to talk about the Washington Monument. At the very top of the Washington Monument is a verse that says, holiness is unto the Lord. And that just kind of crowns, how he lived his life. Like, God is set apart, but we want to be more like him than we are like us.
Yeah, and he really believed in representative government. He believed in limited powers. It was interesting, too, because I think the King of England at the time looked at how popular he was. He was by far the most popular president. He had won the revolution.
Yeah.
He could have easily stepped in, as all of the examples of Europe, and become a king.
Yeah, they wanted to make him king.
But they wanted to. But he literally, I remember, I can't remember which king it was at the time, but the King of England said he would be the greatest man that's ever lived if he steps down.
Yeah.
But he obviously didn't believe he would, but he did. He did 2 terms, and guess what he did? He went back to Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah.
And he finished out his life there and became an intricate support to all of the other leaders. And so it really is George Washington, what an incredible person. So let's shift and talk about architecture in the Capitol and the spiritual symbolism. Me and you got to do some tours. We actually got a behind the scenes. Everyone was gone, and we were just kind of walking. We had a congressman that kind of let us like walk around the Capitol, like we were invited in. And it was a pretty powerful tour.
So inside the Capitol Rotunda, etched in stone, are these words from Psalm 19:1: "The heavens declare the glory of God." So that's etched in stone. So separation of church and state. People, go to the Capitol Rotunda in D.C. and just look up and start reading the Bible. That's what you're going to find there. It's etched.
Matter of fact, some of our congressmen probably need to do that right now.
Probably.
If you're a congressman listening to this, you need to go to the Rotunda right now, look up, and just start reading. Please do that.
Step outside of the Rotunda. There's a congressional prayer room that was put in by Dwight Eisenhower, I believe, is who they told us. And now that's a prayer room that you can't just get into. I mean, we were able to see.
Only members of Congress can go in.
Because we were members of Congress were there. Actually, did we get into that with you?
We did actually go in, but we couldn't take any pictures. Okay. And it was certainly a private spot.
Yeah, it was
the members.
Yeah, you got to be really careful in there. But there's inside the United States Capitol is a prayer room with Bibles and Christian literature all over the wall for lawmakers to go and commune with God. So again, separation of church and state.
So one of my favorite spots were when we actually went into the House chamber.
Oh,
and by the way, it is a lot smaller than you think. Like I can just think of like when the president comes in for the State of the Union on TV, it looks like it's huge. Oh my gosh, that room is like smaller than our auditorium.
Oh yeah.
It's very small. It's very, very tight. But on the walls, you have all of these paintings of biblical figures and even figures from antiquity and different figures.
Lawmakers and like kings and rulers. And
absolutely. But there's one that's right over the speaker's desk, the speaker's chair. And it's interesting. It's interesting, though, because all of the rulers and the different people of history, they're all looking sideways. They're like side busts. Yeah. But the only one that's looking straight at the people is Moses. And Moses is literally looking over the speaker's shoulder down to where they come up to the podium to vote. So every single lawmaker that gets up and goes cast their vote, Moses is literally staring at them like, hey, you remember. I thought that was just absolutely incredible.
Oh, and everyone else, all the other busts that are facing sideways are looking at Moses. So that's kind of the direction that they're facing. They're all looking at him to give him, honor.
Because that's the law of the land, the 10 Commandments. And we also, when we got to the Supreme Court, talk about some of that, the Library of Congress, the Jefferson Memorial.
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court has multiple depictions of the 10 Commandments and Moses. So on the outside of the Supreme Court, at the top of the building, is Moses holding the 10 Commandments.
Because that's the foundation of the moral law. It's the foundation of all Western civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all over the place there. You go to the Library of Congress, and there's also there's actually a Moses with the 10 Commandments in the middle of that, the Jefferson Library of Congress. Inside the Jefferson Memorial, you have him again, who's talking about God gave us liberty, right? Can the liberties of a nation be secure? When he removed conviction, they says liberties are a gift from God. That's one of his quotes that you find inside the Jefferson Memorial. You go over to the National Archives and you see a statue about that is a declaration and a constitution. It's talking about the future and the past, and it's referring to divine accountability, saying God is watching what we've done in the past. He's watching what we do in the future. I already mentioned the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. How long did we stand in there? Just you're reading the Gettysburg Address, and it's like a sermon.
Yeah, it literally is a sermon.
Yeah.
And it's incredible when it was spoken. You have this incredible loss of life, this incredible down moment. You know, Lincoln, even when he was giving it, it was like kind of this quick thing. Even the people around him were kind of rushing him and, you know, getting him out. But it becomes this iconic, essentially battle cry for freedom. I mean, it's absolutely an incredible moment. Lincoln, by the way, I will tell you, unlike the House room, which is a lot smaller than I thought, the Lincoln Memorial was a lot bigger than I thought. I mean, Lincoln was, I think of like 90th Museum, you know, Lincoln coming alive. I kept looking over my shoulder like, hey, you know, what's going on? And we just constantly see this imagery of the Ten Commandments, which is the moral law. And there's lots of people, they wonder why this is such a big deal. It's because it's foundational. It's first principles. I mean, those laws literally set the foundation for our justice system, for our way of government, even how our founders thought about how to lead. You know, Moses appears in at least 8 federal buildings in Washington, D.C., the Supreme Court, which we mentioned, the House of Representatives, but also the National Archives and even the Department of Justice. Why? Because all justice comes down from the moral law. It's worked out in principles through the moral law.
You can't separate it. And so that's the point. You can't separate our faith tradition from the founding of our country, no matter how hard people try. All it takes is one intellectually honest trip to Washington, D.C. Just look around, man, and like it's all there. You're going to find all of it. One of the other things we learned about, I didn't actually know about this until my first Wallbuilders trip, was the Aiken Bible. And so in 1782, Congress approved the publication of a Bible that was done by Robert Aiken. And what's interesting, of course, they were all still using like the King James Bible, which had his name on it. And so Congress told him like, well, you should put your name in there on the front page. And he was like, I'm leaving that page blank, because it doesn't, the name of who compiled this is not what matters. It's the one who gave it, which is the Word of God. And this got to be known as the Bible of the Revolution. And it's important for people to understand this. Congress reviewed and approved it for the use in schools and churches. And they said this, they said the Holy Scriptures for the use of schools, when they labeled it, that is what it was for, is for the people, to make sure that the people at the founding of this country, even before it was a country, that the founding of it, that everybody had a Bible. And Robert Aiken wanted to put it in their hands, and Congress said, we're going to help make that happen.
Yeah, one of the coolest parts of the trip, I had not known about that Bible either. I'm going to try to get my hands on one, or maybe a remake. I would just love to have that, because the revolution of the Bible. Yeah, I'll definitely probably get a remake. But one of the things I thought was really, really cool is the Capitol was actually used as a church. Not just any church, but it was actually the largest church in the entire region. From 1800 to 1867, the U.S. Capitol was used for weekly Christian worship services. Thomas Jefferson, while serving as president, attended services in the House chamber and even authorized the Marine Band to be the worship band.
How about that?
It's crazy. Like,
look, wait a minute. So the deist, non-Christian Thomas Jefferson, he went to church his entire presidency inside the Capitol, and then made the Marine Band be the worship team.
Yeah, and
sounds pretty un-Christian to me.
And in a nation where Protestantism was really, really, separated, and they're all different denominations, this was actually a large non-denominational church. It was intended by members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and even the public would show up. They would say that there were services that were so packed you couldn't squeeze one more person into it.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just constantly there. I mean, for 67 years.
67 years. It was actually the first megachurch in the United States of America. Over 3,000 people would attend. Now, when you go, this was not even the House chambers that we went into. This was Statuary Hall, which is
even smaller.
Even smaller. Like, we're in there with maybe 100 people, and we're like kind of starting to fill it up. They're like, no, they crammed 3,000 in.
Yeah, you're moving into a new building, and the first thing you said was, I think we can have 250 people in here. And I said, bro, you went to Washington with me. We could get maybe not 3,000. We could definitely, but it's crazy to say we get 1,500 people in here, And so, but it was packed, and the Capitol's a church. Then probably
by the way, this was pre-deodorant. This is how much people wanted to be in church. 3,000 people packed into a room that probably comfortably might fit 300.
Yeah. So in D.C., most of the time is hot or humid. It's usually not, freezing or humid. It literally is in a swamp, which I was I mean, you hear historical accounts, and the geography, it's so much more condensed than you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so anyways, it was really neat. One of the perhaps the most impactful trip of it. I obviously, it was awesome being there, but they have this incredible museum called the Museum of the Bible.
Yeah, that's great.
And yeah, the Green family's involved in it. There's lots of just artifacts from a Jewish, Judeo-Christian religion, original manuscripts. Really, some great just what would you call those exhibits and different things,
artifacts, things like that. I mean, they have.
We would go to that on both trips.
Both trips, yeah. Actually, we kind of started and ended. But yeah, the Museum of the Bible, I mean, they have multiple floors of original manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls. You get to see how the printing press was made, and they teach you. We saw, where they had collected like burned Bibles and burned books from the past. I mean, it's an amazing place. If you ever go to D.C., put that on the top of your
You should do it every single time. You could spend 3 weeks in there. Now, the first trip, we were with our wives, and so we had to go get lunch and do the romantic stuff. Okay, but the second trip, we spent quite a bit of time. As a matter of fact, I want to pivot. I want to talk about the second trip that we took just weeks later, where we essentially were on the Hill this time. Like, it was full business. Everyone's running and going. We got to see all kinds of representatives. I'm going to actually let you lead this part because I just realized all of my notes for this part, I don't have them. So you're going to be pushing us along in this section. But it was so fitting that we see the Judeo-Christian underpinning in the first trip. And then the next trip is like, okay, let's actually be like our founders. Let's step up and talk and partner with our Jewish brothers and sisters on the Hill.
Yeah, well, the second trip, as you mentioned, was with Eagle's Wings. And to bridge this, I'm going to give you 3 quotes from American presidents about Israel, and then we'll pivot into Israel. So John Adams, for example, he said, "I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist, I should still believe that the fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations." How about that? That's what John Adams said about the Jewish people. George Washington, in a letter to the Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island, said, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants. For happily the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance." Speaking of the Jewish people, we should probably take that to heart right now today.
Especially right now with all the anti-Semitism, with all the even really their terrorist attacks against our Jewish brothers and sisters. And history, our founders would have essentially acknowledged the truth that we as Christians owe a great debt. I heard somebody say, I thought this was so good. You don't need Christianity to prove Judaism,
right?
But you need Judaism to prove Christianity. And we really are brothers. I mean, we share a common heritage. We share common values. All of it goes back to the 10 Commandments. I tell people in our church all the time, people are, they're constantly like, Jesus was a Christian. I'm like, no, he wasn't. Jesus was a Jew, but he wasn't just was a Jew. Jesus is a Jew.
Right.
He was an Orthodox Jew. Like he kept the law perfectly. Like he obviously pulled people back to the spirit of the law, but the truth is he's coming back as a conquering Jewish king.
That's right.
And so I think this is so timely too, because there's so much hate, there's so much misunderstanding among Christians in how we relate to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And this was a really, really good trip.
Yeah, it was good. Abraham Lincoln, he mentioned earlier, he actually overturned what was known as General Order Number 11 in the South, which expelled Jews from part of the American South. He said it was unjust, and he told his wife right before he passed, he said this: "We will visit the Holy Land to see those places hallowed by the footsteps of the Savior. There is no city on earth I so much desire to see as Jerusalem." He had a love in his heart.
That was Abraham Lincoln?
That was Abraham Lincoln.
So historians say these were some of his very last words.
Last words.
To his wife, before he was killed by John Wilkes Booth.
Fascinating. So that just shows you even some of our early presidents cared about Israel. So we got there. We actually started at the Holocaust Museum, which I'll just bring back to your remembrance, because that was a powerful, impactful time there. And I know you've been to the one in Israel and the one here. Maybe you can tell us about
absolutely.
that.
Every single person, it's important. If you don't remember the past, you not only forget it, but because you forget it, you'll repeat it. And this was, one of the signs when you come in, always remember, bear witness to what happened. And I think it's important that we do face the reality that happened in Christian Europe. Yeah. In a time where we, a lot of believers were involved. A lot of kind of cultural Christianity had taken place and had mixed. The church had kind of forgotten that it's to be the conscience to the state and to stand up when the state's wrong. And, the Holocaust Museum was amazing. I will say Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, that is a must for every single person. But I will say this was an incredible museum in our nation's capital, remembering perhaps one of the not perhaps, it is 6 million Jewish brothers and sisters were murdered, men, women, and children. Systematically, we talk a lot about genocide, and everyone likes to compare everything to the Holocaust, but the truth is, nothing compares to the Holocaust. There are the ideologies, something I always try to say, oh man, they're like Hitler. We like to call everyone Hitler. And it's like we forget that Hitler was godless. Yeah. Hitler actually fought religion. There wasn't much they were national socialists. They were more akin to the Soviet Union and communism than they were to this idea of this right and left dichotomy. It's like, no. It was the same godless, atheist foundation that was built on, and ultimately it almost annihilated an entire group of people. But that Holocaust Museum was pretty incredible.
It was a visceral reminder.
It's hard to say incredible. The experience was sobering.
Yeah, it was sobering. Yeah. For me, it was a visceral reminder that evil triumphs when truth and good remain silent.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. Like, this can never happen again. This is why we have to speak up. So anyway, so we started there, and that really did sort of set the tone, which I'm so grateful that we went there first for what was going to happen. So that night we had dinner with, to your point, 300, people gathered in this room, probably 2/3 pastors, about 1/3 rabbis. We heard from Speaker Mike Johnson, from Senator Cory.
That was at the Museum of the Bible. So we got to go back to the Museum of the Bible. Yep. And one of the things I noticed in D.C. and I'm noticing in cities all around the country, and it really is a very, very sad state of affairs. We walk up to the Museum of the Bible, and somehow the purple-haired jihadis, anti-Semite, crowd heard about us. And there's one thing, when you're essentially protesting, like there's rules and ways that you do that. Even in our Constitution, you just have a right to bully people. Right. And it's amazing at every step of the way on this trip, we had this really satanic antichrist spirit just 100%. Like coming against. And it wasn't just speaking their opinions about the government decisions or their opinions about what's happening in another place in the world. They were literally like intimidating, pushing down on our Jewish brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Of course, I wasn't having any of it.
Throwing fake blood out there. It was crazy. So yeah, we had that. That's day 2. We ran into him again. I'll let you tell that in a second. But that night, we got to hear, like I said, from Mike Johnson, from Cory Booker, which was a really weird experience. I don't know how somebody could be so wrong on so many things and then be so right on this, but he was. And then from Mike Huckabee, who is the new ambassador to Israel.
He videoed in on that.
Great job. Yeah. And they all had things to say that were essentially boiled down to this: we have to support Israel, period. Like, full stop. We have to support Israel. And that point was made clear. Day 2, we went and met with some reps. I'll read these off since you don't have these notes, and then we can kind of talk through them. So we got to go meet with some folks. Some of this was staffers and some of it was actual reps, but Dan Crenshaw, Chip Roy's office, Michael McCall, Michael Cloud,
Curtis
Bluver,
great rabbis. Yeah.
Marjorie Green Taylor,
we saved her.
Carter. We actually saved her from some Code Pink idiots. What happened at lunch first? Because then we ran into, they're like following us around all day. It was
it was interesting because we all had appointments and we met with over 100 on Capitol Hill. It was actually a pretty productive, powerful day. We were kind of grouped in our states, because we were their constituents. So that was really, really good. So we got to meet some just really great reps. But for whatever reason, about the time it started getting late and we had a little bit of a break and I got hungry, and me and you hunted down the Capitol cafeteria. And so I walk in and some of the pastors are already there sitting at a table that I know. And there's this group of I want to say it looked like a field trip or something. They were dressed. I didn't pay much attention to them.
Field trip.
I walk up and a Capitol police officer is just getting in their face about not recording and not causing problems. And I start going, okay, these guys are a problem. We would run into them repeatedly throughout the day.
Crazy women in beta males.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's exactly right. It was crazy. And so I remember I sat down, and for those of you who know me, I won't do stuff unless I'm provoked.
Hold on. We're at a table with like 8 pastors, and all of them
and rabbis
and me.
There's 3 rabbis on the corner.
We're like polite, like we'll talk a little more tolerant, and they picked you.
Oh, it was crazy. So I'm sitting there. I'm minding my own business. I'm eating my little sushi. I had some sushi. It was not quite as good as HEB sushi, but it's pretty good. And I'm looking. I'm next to a pastor that knows me, has been to Israel with me before, and we're just sitting there. And there's this group, and they start getting louder. When people talk at you, they're not actually talking to you. They're like talking talking at you. So we pray over our food. And then the next thing I hear is like, these pastors are here and they're praying over their food while children in Gaza are suffering, as if the problem in Gaza is the amount of food. It's not. The Israelis have been feeding the Gazans forever, but Hamas takes it, sells it on the black market to continue fighting Israel.
Kills their own people.
It's crazy.
To get
so it's nuts. But so I kind of hear all this stuff, and for me, the anger kind of starts in my neck, kind of rolls up to my ear. My ears start getting red, and for whatever reason, this beta male, and when I say beta male, guys, listen, it was beyond worship pastor skinny jeans.
Oh my God!
I mean, it was. He's surrounded by all these really militant, aggressive women, which were probably cat ladies. I'm sorry if you love cats. That's fine. Just hopefully you have some kids and some other things that mean something in your life
too, and not 25.
And for whatever reason, he walks up to me. Of all the pastors there, he walks up to me and he says, "Are you scared?"
And right when that happened, I have to tell you this. Right when that happened, what was your friend? Was it Malik?
Malik's next to me.
He looks to me. I look at him, and at the same time, we both go, "He picked the wrong one." We said it to each other, and then this happens.
So I look up. And then I stand up, and I'm not taller than most people, but he's a beta male, so I'm taller than him. And he's balding and super passionate and whatever. I look straight at him, and I look him up, I look him down, and I go, "You mean of a beta male?" "No, I'm not scared of you." And I just stare at him. And then all the other little people start chiming in. "Well, Jesus said this. Didn't Jesus say to blah, blah, blah?" And I said, "Is that all Jesus said?"
Yeah.
"Oh, well, is that all Jesus said?" And then one of them spouted off, "Aren't you supposed to be a pastor?" And I just looked at him and I said, "Ma'am, I'm not supposed to be a pastor. I am a pastor."
Yeah. And who's yours?
Yeah. Well, that's what I said. "Well, I just think a pastor should be." "Really, you think that? What church do you go to?" And I said, "What church do you go to?" And I'm having this conversation. It's hilarious. I'm just like engaging them. Everyone else is just like, they might as well have some popcorn. They're just watching.
I'm pretty sure it
was so cool to see because my rabbi friends were kind of in the corner. They were on the far side of the table. And they kind of had their head down and they were eating. And every now and then they would look up. I'd say something, they'd look up and they'd smile. And then they look back down, which was really funny because dignity in the Jewish culture is a real big deal. In the Protestant tradition, it's not that big of a deal. So in that moment, I literally felt like these are my friends. These are like, we're here. We're not causing problems. You're getting in our face. And man, they just keep going on. So finally, I'm like, "What church do you go to? What church do you go to?" And she goes, "Well, I'm the founder of Code Pink." And I said, "I know what religion you belong to. Now tell me what church you go to." And it was just this interesting thing because we get up and we leave and Capitol Police end up coming over and kind of dealing with it a little bit. But they would just be on us all day long. Yep. We would get up, we would go a building over, 2 floors down. I really wanted to be Marjorie Taylor Greene. I was like, what are the chances? Maybe we can meet her. We walk into her office, and right there is the Code Pink crazy person. It was like they stuck to us all day.
Yeah.
And so we got to step in and go.
We rescued her.
We did, and she was very, very grateful. You could tell she was tired. I would imagine in a place like that, she was like, "Thank you." And so we got a picture with her, and then we would go in, and they had a big event, and it was incredible. They had SWAT because it was getting aggressive. I mean, the people that were there were multiplying, and like I said, this was not just like protesting with a sign.
It was spiritual harassment.
No, it was harassment. They were invading body space and all of that. Yep. I mean, it wasn't good. And so you see all of these SWAT guys come in to go sit at the bottom of a stairwell right in front just in case they needed to like get into action. And didn't you have a Texas guy with some guy had some zip ties?
He had big old zip ties, and I don't remember what I asked him a question about the zip ties, and he just kind of looked at the crazy ladies, looked at me, and says, "Ain't my first rodeo. I know how to rope a calf." And started walking off.
But the event was absolutely incredible. We got to be a part of a reception. I mean, really, it was. I think a lot of times we wonder what could we do. Yeah. What should we do? How do we speak out? I think one of the best things we can do is just be that friend that when some mouthy, lying propagandist leftist comes and starts yelling at your friends, you're like, "Hey, you know what? In that day, he needed a friend to step up and go, we're not going to do this anymore." I will say one point in their conversation, at some point, it's very difficult to argue with an unreasonable person.
Right.
And so at some point I was just like, I'm not talking to you anymore. And I always tell people in our church, I'm like, just because somebody gets in your face and asks you a question, you don't have to answer anything.
You don't owe it.
Because you don't owe them anything. And, I just was like, nope, I'm not talking to you anymore. Just get out of my face. Just get on my face. I always say, my pastor growing up used to say, you can say really hard, direct things if you just say it sternly and then smile. And so this is literally, I did it 3 or 4 times and they left. I was literally like, get out of my face. You saw me doing it, and Malik's laughing, and everyone's just like, whatever. But it really did show it really did show in the middle of an afternoon. These people are being bussed in. There's all kinds of agendas, but ultimately at the bottom of all of it is, I taught about this on midweek. Matter of fact, we're going to have an episode where we talk about the spirit of Amalek, which is really the spirit of opposition to God's people. Christians and Jews.
Yeah.
Make no mistake, like they hate all of us. Those people, like they would tear down, they would hurt all of us. And so I think sometimes we think, well, maybe if it's a Christian, no. These are people that are against the people of God,
Yep.
and they exist all throughout history.
Yeah, all over time and space. So that was pretty wild. But the meetings themselves were good and constructive. And met Congressman Brandon Gill, new freshman on the
Great guy.
take over a seat that needed an upgrade. And what was cool is the day after this event, we saw where many of the people that our contingency had met with sent a letter to President Trump with our talking points, like asking him to do the things we'd asked him to do. And then he went to the Middle East right after that. And I know there's some, question marks about everything that he's doing there and what's going on. But I walked away feeling very confident that there are some clear thinking people in Washington, especially on the topic of Israel, that are advocating the things that we felt like they needed to advocate.
Well, Trump is the most pro-Israel president that's ever been.
Yeah.
Bottom line, I mean, when you look at in his first term, he moves their capital, which has always been their capital in their eyes.
Yeah.
But because of political reasons and pressure from all of the neighbors, it's interesting. There's lots of places where Christians can live. There's lots of Christian nations they can live. There's lots of Muslim nations where Muslims can live and Buddhists where they can live. There's one nation that is Jewish.
Right.
There's only one, and it's tiny when you take a look at that area. And President Trump, man, against all advisors of presidents for decades, essentially said no, their capital's Jerusalem, and moved it.
Yep.
I was actually in
the embassy.
No, last year I was in there. I was actually in Israel, and I went to the Capitol, and I had my Trump hat on. I'm like the Trump pastor. It's pretty funny, but I couldn't. I was stopped repeatedly by the Jewish people there saying thank you.
Wow.
And I remember walking over. I walked over we were at dinner one night, and there was the embassy. And I was like, that's awesome. And I ran over there, and man, when I got there, people were on me like crazy. And they're like, give me your passport. And I pulled up my passport, and I was like, you see what it says on there? It says United States of America. That's my embassy. And it was so funny because they literally immediately snapped out, and they're like, oh, okay. They wanted to take my phone before. Now they're like, hey, come here. I'll get a picture with you and your friends. It was
crazy.
And so, there really is one of the best things I think you can do is obviously use your voice. The Bible's very, very clear.
Yeah.
That God remains with his people.
Yep.
The Christians and the Jews. However, I think one of the best things you can do is just be a good friend. What would a good friend do? Would a good friend just sit there and be silent? I mean, no. A good friend would speak up if there's injustice, if there's wrong.
Yeah.
You have to speak it. And so, yeah.
Yeah, it was great. Well, before we wrap this up, just a few things to mention. I think as we reflect on our time with Wallbuilders, there was so much emphasis on the 10 Commandments and on history and tradition. And one of the cool things I've mentioned is that here in Texas, we just passed a law to put the 10 Commandments back into every classroom, every public school classroom. And they did that because of the history and tradition test. And it's super important that we don't just rely on the history and tradition of the past, but we continue to perpetuate
Absolutely.
it. So that's why we have to take advantage of the rights that we have, the Lemon-Kirschman decision being overturned, get faith back into the public square, continue the traditions. That's super important. Also, it's time to confront. There's a lot of false media narratives going around right now. Hamas literally makes a claim, CNN and the New York Times parrot it as if it's true, and then people go out and pull anti-Semitic acts of terror here in the United States. We've seen two great people who are connected to Eagles Wings that were murdered outside of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C.
Not that it matters, but they were Jewish Christians.
They were Jewish Christians. That's why they were killed, because they were Jewish Christians. Just this past week, we saw more attacks in Colorado, from some Egyptian nationalist to
illegal alien
who was here illegally. Yep. And then goes after an 88-year-old Jewish woman. And it's
who survived the Holocaust.
Survived the Holocaust, only to be attacked in the United States of America by an Egyptian who wasn't even supposed to be here. I mean, it's crazy. And a lot of that's being fueled by the media false narrative. So do your homework, find out what's really going on, and educate your friends. And then I just want to leave you with the biblical mandate here, a few scriptures, if that's all right.
Yeah, let's do
as
that.
we wrap this up. Genesis 12:3, first of all, says, I will bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. Psalm 122,
So to the Israelites, to the Jewish
people of Israel. That's right, the Jewish people. Psalm 122:6 tells us to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Romans 11 reminds us that we are grafted into Israel's covenant. And Isaiah 62:1, the Lord himself says, for Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and neither should we.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible way to wrap up this kind of two-trip episode. We talked about our heritage, which really is founded on the Ten Commandments, which are Jewish. That were the basis for all civilization. And then we rounded in how we actually support the people. It's not just the idea, it's the people, and they're under attack. I'm reminded as we close of one of the founders of our nation, Benjamin Franklin. He was stepping out of the Constitutional Convention, and everyone was really eager to see what kind of government we got. So they asked, what kind of government do we have? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. And I think we always have to remember God knew when he placed our feet in this time exactly what was going to happen. And he has given us everything we need if we'll obey him to keep this nation great and to make sure that we're still one nation under God. Yeah, that wraps up this episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.
Thank you for joining us today on the Under God podcast. If this episode encouraged you, share it with a friend or family member. Your support helps us reach more people with God's word. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and at UnderGodPodcast.com so that you never miss an episode. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, X, True Social, and TikTok for more content, behind-the-scenes moments, and faith-filled encouragement throughout the week. We want to hear from you. Leave a comment, join the conversation, and send us your questions. We will be answering them in upcoming Q&A episodes. Until next time, remember to think biblically about the things that matter most.